True Crime Conversations acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast was recorded on.
Just a warning, this story and this opening scene features descriptions of pregnancy loss and stillbirth. If that's triggering for you, perhaps give this episode a miss. It's November 2022 in Toronto, Canada, and Amy Perry is on the phone coaching a woman in labour. She's helping her breathe through her contractions. She's giving her words of encouragement. She's talking her through the various positions she can get her body in to help her manage her pain. As a doula for many years now, Amy has dealt with all sorts of women from all walks of life, welcoming babies into the world in all manner of ways. But tonight's client has a particularly heartbreaking story. Kaitlyn Braun is 24, and her pregnancy is the result of an assault. She only recently found out that her baby, a girl, died in utero at about 32 weeks gestation. So Amy is giving her all to Caitlyn, being her emotional anchor through 40 hours of labour, barely sleeping or eating, as she does her best to support the emotional young woman. As labour intensifies, Amy encourages Caitlyn to get into an Uber and get to the hospital. This baby is coming soon. Caitlyn gives birth to a beautiful, sleeping baby girl called Eden. Over the phone, the new mum describes holding her, having skin to skin with her, meeting her, a beautiful but heartbreaking experience. But Caitlyn was never pregnant. She didn't give birth, and she never went to hospital. She was lying to Amy the entire time, through days and hours upon hours of phone calls. And this isn't the first time she's done this. I'm Gemma Barth, and this is True Crime Conversations, a podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. Kaitlyn Braun is a repeat offender. As recently as January 2025, she pled guilty to fresh charges in court. At the age of 26, she has dozens of victims. She's a serial conwoman, and her shtick? Well, she pretends she's pregnant and in the need of emergency support. Even with time behind bars and apologies and promises in court, Caitlyn has repeated her crime over and over again. Sarah Treleaven is a journalist and immersed herself in Caitlyn's bizarre crimes for more than a year and a half, trying to make sense of them. This year, she released a podcast, The Con, Caitlyn's Baby, which tells those stories. Sarah joins us now. Sarah, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you found yourself investigating this story?
Sure. I mean, this story came my way and it was sort of both immediately shocking and completely up my alley. And I just saw a headline, and I'm paraphrasing, but it was something along the line of like, woman fakes multiple pregnancies, lies to doulas, something like that. It was just sort of a very small kernel of what this story is. And my hands, as soon as I saw that, were like shaking as I went to go do some more research on what actually had happened, because I immediately knew that there was like this whole world there associated with this woman to explore. And part of how I knew that is that for many years, really almost a decade, I've had a real fascination, I would say broadly, in women who live double lives, but particularly women who have factitious disorder or related disorders, women who feign illnesses or crises for emotional gratification. So not the GoFundMe scammers we're all used to seeing, but people who do it to meet an emotional need. It's such an interesting thing to me and such a outsized maladaptive activity. And so I found it absolutely fascinating, and I immediately gravitated towards Caitlyn's story and wanted to know as much as possible.
What do we know about Kaitlyn Braun and her background and her childhood? Can you set the scene a bit?
You know, there are parts of Caitlyn's life that we haven't been able to access yet, but we do know quite a bit about her through friends, through family members, through just how public this case became, not just Canada, but globally. And so we know that Caitlyn grew up in a relatively rural community outside of Toronto. She was a not very happy kid. I mean, when we start to look at her life trajectory, I don't think there's any one particular causal reason that she ended up doing what she did. But from a very early age, friends and family members report her having pretty serious anxiety. Her parents divorced when she was young. She had separation anxiety. She reported feeling rejected by her father. One of the anecdotes that I've heard that has stayed with me is that when Caitlyn's mother would go to work, this was after her parents' divorce, Caitlyn's mother would go to work, and Caitlyn, who was quite young at the time, would repeatedly call her and ask for reassurances that she was coming home. And so I think you see from a fairly early age this very profound sense of difference and alienation and kind of a bottomless pit of need. She wanted friends to be super affectionate with her. She wanted physical touch, but she also wanted emotional intimacy. Over time, this graduates to fabrications in order to get what she wants, the compassion she needs, the attention she needs, the intimacy she needs. But at the same time, Caitlyn is seemingly a somewhat productive member of society. She graduates from high school. She graduates from university. She becomes a social worker. She is working with vulnerable populations of people. And it's really interesting to go back and look at Caitlyn's social media now because, the media surrounding this case and also, just images that people have grabbed and posted on social media. In a lot of those images, Caitlyn has what I would call crazy eyes, where you're looking at this picture of her. Yeah. And you're like, well, how would you not know that this perfect person, was not a safe person? But you go back and you look at the breadth of her presence online, how she comported herself, who she presented as. And, she was a very young woman in her early 20s, sort of making her way in the world. She appeared to be altruistic. She appeared to be a devout Christian. She had this sort of cover for this double life that she was living. And it was very convincing.
I need to ask straight up, because it was a question that sat in the back of my head the entire time I kind of was listening to your podcast and researching this story. Do we know if Caitlyn has ever been pregnant?
We do not know that as a matter of fact. No, we don't know that.
Which is a fascinating question when we start getting into it.
I understand from friends of Caitlyn's that she did not have romantic entanglements. Now, that doesn't mean she couldn't have been pregnant.
Yeah.
But we do know, for example, she didn't have obvious romantic entanglements that would have, for example, led to a pregnancy. Now, people can get pregnant other ways by choice and not. But I think that was sort of one of the key questions that was asked very early on when people found out that she was faking pregnancies, right? Maybe she did at some point legitimately lose a pregnancy, and this was part of how she was coping with it. This was how the trauma was being expressed.
Yeah.
But we don't have any information about that, and we have no indication that is in fact something that happened.
Before she does get into the faking pregnancies world, I'm going to call it, was she lying about other things, as a teenager, as a young adult, before she kind of found this particular area?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about it, a lot of Caitlyn's lies that we know about are nested. So it's lie nested in a lie, nested in another lie. And you actually see that start to happen pretty early in her life, really by her kind of mid to late teens. A number of friends have told me that she lied to them about sexually assaulted. Now, it's really hard to obviously make that assertion, period. It's really hard to say that about anyone, let alone a good friend. But some of these friends, it got to the point where she was literally coming to them on a weekly basis saying she had been sexually assaulted, and by different people in different contexts, to the point where it did strain, credulity. It just didn't make sense. And all of these friends I spoke to who reported this said they tried to believe her and they wanted to believe her. And then they got to this unbelievably challenging position in the friendship where they were like, this is not plausible. And I don't know what to do with that, because you're coming to me and you're telling me you need help for something that is indisputably awful. And I feel like there's something else going on here. And that's where it started to tip and people started to feel like they were being taken advantage of. But I will say the allegations of what have been reported to us as false allegations, and Caitlyn has been charged with making false allegations. Those often were accompanied by lies about being pregnant. And that started years ago. That did not start with her outreach to doulas. It started long before. I think she tested a lot of waters with family members she's now estranged from, with friends she's now estranged from. But we do know that those sort of core lies that she perpetuated with the doulas, lying about being sexually assaulted, and then lying about being pregnant as a result of that assault, that has been going on for some time, despite the fact that she's still a very young woman.
She did start to kind of focus in on doulas as, I guess, her victim in this scenario. How would you describe the kind of con she created there? Because it's pretty similar from victim to victim, but it changes slightly.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say just up top that Caitlyn was really good at this. I mean, she was really good at picking a victim and then super capably manipulating them. So what she would do is reach out to a doula. We don't know this as a matter of fact, but the doulas I spoke to have told me that they got the sense that she kind of investigated them before she did outreach, because sort of magically, doulas that were queer, Caitlyn presented as queer. Doulas who were Christian, Caitlyn presented as Christian. One doula had a sister who had fallen into a coma. At the end of Caitlyn's sort of very long protracted con with this doula, where everything went wrong medically, she lapsed into a coma. And so a lot of these doulas felt like this was an extra layer of manipulation. She would actually find their individual sort of pressure points and push them to maximize her ability to create intimacy, almost like an affinity scam.
Yeah.
The other thing she did is she just had an incredibly tragic story that all of these doulas who work with women who have been sexually assaulted, who have experienced stillbirth, who have been mistreated in the medical health system. Caitlyn used all those things and weaponized them against these doulas, because these doulas were primed to be on her side, because they've seen all these things before. They knew these things happen. They couldn't believe that all these things were happening to one person, but almost immediately, Caitlyn said, I'm experiencing all these horrific things. I've been sexually assaulted. I'm now pregnant. The baby's stillborn. My family has rejected me either because I wanted to keep the baby, or sometimes it was because she was queer. I don't want to go to the hospital because, I've been mistreated at the hospital. The doulas, were told that they were the only person that could help her, which is an enormous responsibility to take on. But all of these doulas have signed up to take care of people, even in incredibly rough circumstances. So that additional layer of manipulation, I think, made it very hard for these doulas to set any boundaries, to question her narrative. It's really easy to listen now and say, well, who would believe this? But these doulas were, Caitlyn was calling them, at 3:00 in the morning, and then 4:00 in the morning, and then 5:30. I mean, they were sleep deprived. Some of them were barely eating. When Caitlyn, there was a case involving Caitlyn not too long ago, and part of the evidence was that she had sent a doula 600 text messages in 2 days.
Wow.
That is enormous volume of communication to keep up with. And you barely have time to think when someone is bombarding you with their needs like that.
You also don't automatically go to someone who's lying. If someone is asking for help and telling you all these horrible things, you're not immediately going to be like, well, I better investigate them before I help them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's just, that's not what doulas do, right? If you have to build trust almost immediately in order to do the kind of intimate work that doulas do, and I think they deal with women who are not believed in a lot of different contexts, including, in the context of medicalized pregnancies, in the context of, sexual assault. Again, these things that Caitlyn really tapped into. And so a doula is someone who's going to be on your side. And it is not that person's role to doubt what you're telling them, to sort of, to use, their critical analytical skills to think back on whether the timing of your, story really makes sense.
Yeah.
That's not what they're there to do. They're there to provide support to you when you tell them that you need it, and they're there to believe you.
For those that aren't familiar with the birth world, can you explain, because a doula is very different to a midwife in terms of the services that they offer?
Yes. So this is also where people get confused, because they're kind of like, didn't they notice that like Caitlyn's cervix wasn't dilated? That's not what a doula does.
No.
They're not medical professionals. And so they're there less to help you give birth, like the actual physical act of giving birth, and more to provide you with emotional and educational support. And they're very focused on the mother. Like, what does that person need at any given moment? Like the person who's going to give birth, what do they need? What kind of reassurance do they need? What do they need for physical relief? What do they need for emotional relief? What information do they need right now? And, it can start long before labor and, go beyond the birth of a baby. It's very different than a midwife who's like measuring your belly and checking, and doing physical checks, and obviously quite different than a doctor. So, again, it's not a trust but verify position. There's not really a verification role involved in being a doula. It's about trusting the person who has come to you and said they need help.
I also think something to consider with the role of a doula is, because they are helping women in, often the most vulnerable time of their life, they share a lot of vulnerabilities themselves to kind of get that trust. So they might open up about their own lives. Like, it's a very emotional job. You are trying to create a very special emotional connection to get that woman through, which adds a whole other kind of layer to this.
Yeah, I mean, and it's a lot of time like that you spend with somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Think about like sometimes women are in labor for days, and it's literally like, a doula, we were chatting earlier, I mentioned, this is one doula I met has a deal in her contract where she gets to take a break after 24 hours. I mean, that's 24 hours of being with this woman or this person who's in labor and helping them by like offering them massage or like, doing things to help induce labor or like talking them through things or explaining what's about to happen. But there's also time between, contractions, when things speed up, when things slow down, where it's just the two of you sitting on the couch together or like taking a nap on the bed. I mean, that's the other intimacy of this. It's just, and especially in the context of somebody who's unaccompanied, like Caitlyn, who doesn't have like a partner there, for example.
Yeah.
It's a very fast bond that I think is established in that set of circumstances. And yeah, these doulas absolutely became vulnerable with Caitlyn, in part because Caitlyn was sharing so much and so much heavy, heavy, heavy trauma that, yeah, I mean, I think it's human nature to want to reciprocate on some level.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with Sarah Treleaven, journalist and host of the podcast The Con, Caitlyn's baby. Next, we dive into the stories of Amy and Katie, two doulas who believe Caitlyn had given birth to a stillborn baby, but that was only the start of the dramatic lies she told them. I want to tell some of these women's stories just to give listeners an idea of how deep this con went and this emotional attachment went. I want to start with Amy's story, which I kind of told the start of at the start of this episode. I cut it right after she gave birth to a stillborn baby called Eden, whose pregnancy she said was the result of an assault. But the birth was actually only the start, really, of what she put Amy and her fellow kind of doula Katie through. They were kind of tag teaming through this situation, weren't they? Can you kind of pick us up at that point? Because they were providing her support over the phone. They've already provided days of support to get her to birth, and then it just keeps going.
Yes. So Amy and Katie are, they're doulas who are friendly. They're working together, partly because Katie had other job obligations, and neither of them, knowing how traumatic Caitlyn's situation was, how vulnerable she was, wanted her to be alone at any point. So they really sort of bent over backwards to accommodate Caitlyn. Caitlyn gives birth to Eden. It is She describes it as a really beautiful moment that she finally gets to meet her baby. And, it's sort of, I think Amy describes it as, as nice as a stillbirth can be, where she sees her baby, she gets to hold her baby, and then she has to let her go. This sort of feels to Katie and Amy, who are talking to Caitlyn only over the phone because this is in the thick of COVID and they're not able to get into the hospital. This feels to them like kind of the end of a really sad story. Mm-hmm. But not long after Caitlyn gives birth, she sort of starts making noises. It sounds like she's in discomfort. And Amy's on the phone with her and she says, what's happening? Like, describe to me what's going on. So she has to deliver the placenta and she's describing the discomfort, which, Amy sort of says is normal, just kind of let your body do what it needs to do. But then when she delivers the placenta, there's more bleeding and the bleeding won't stop. And then Caitlyn starts to get very worried because the doctors appear very worried. And she's telling Amy this over the phone. And so the doctors do some exploration. And eventually what they tell her is that she has to have a hysterectomy. Now, Caitlyn at this point is, I believe, a 23-year-old woman who has just given birth to a stillborn baby that was a product of a sexual assault, and it was very much a wanted baby, who is now being told that she will never have her own children. And so Amy, and then, of course, Katie as well, they are absolutely devastated for Caitlyn. Like, they cannot believe this is happening. And so they all sort of grieve together and talk it through and, try to provide what emotional support they can for her. But then the problem is the bleeding still isn't stopping, even after the emergency hysterectomy. So the doctors do more exploration and they find that she actually has stage 4 pelvic cancer. And her prognosis is extremely dim. Caitlyn decides she doesn't really want to go through, after everything she's been through, super invasive treatment that she's been told, that she's reporting to Amy and Katie, is unlikely to work. So she's just going to go with hospice care.
So now she's dying.
So now Caitlyn is dying and looking at palliative care options. And she's reading from brochures for hospice care, places where she can go into palliative care until the end of her life, which appears to be soon. And she's reading from what she says are brochures that the hospital has given to her so she can look into where she wants to go. And it's very detailed. Like, Amy helped Caitlyn write a will and think about, who should Amy and Katie tell when Caitlyn dies? Because Caitlyn has very little contact with her family. And like, what can they do for her to facilitate any remaining relationship there? Like, and who should they announce her death on social media? Does Caitlyn want them to talk to her friends? I mean, all these things that might come up if you thought someone was dying and did not have anyone else in the world. So it's all incredibly sad. And at this point, Amy and Katie have been kept mostly awake for like a week. That Caitlyn is calling them at all times of the day. So at this point, Caitlyn tells Amy and Katie that she's being transferred to another hospital, a hospital that is going to, evaluate her cancer and give her like an updated prognosis. So Amy and Katie hear her being loaded into an ambulance. In the ambulance, she starts to describe feeling uncomfortable. And it's not entirely clear what's going on to Amy, who's on the phone with her at that time. And basically what Caitlyn goes on to describe is a doctor coming into the ambulance and raping her while Katie is on the phone. And at some point, Caitlyn hangs up and Amy is obviously completely beside herself. And she and Katie try to figure out what they're supposed to do. Caitlyn calls back. She is, has already been in touch with the police and it's going to be reported. It's all, it's just a mess, basically. So, and then Caitlyn reports that these doctors that this doctor, and I think there was another doctor implicated, and like, there's going to be an arrest made. And you're talking about, and Caitlyn gave Amy and Katie the names of doctors that she'd implicated in her sexual assault. And when Amy and Katie Googled them, they had privileges at the hospital that Caitlyn said she was at. So the story sort of checks out.
So it was all backed up.
Yeah. And so anyways, after this happens and after these arrests are supposedly made, Amy's girlfriend at the time says, I am going to reach out to a journalist I know and just see if she's heard anything about this, because it would be pretty big news if like a doctor at one of the large hospitals was arrested for raping a patient in the back of an ambulance. Like that is definitely something that would be newsworthy.
A dying woman who's just given birth. Like it doesn't get more headline worthy.
Exactly. So she does some poking around and she can't find anything. She can't find any signs of this story. So she finally says to Amy, don't you think it's a little strange that all of these things have happened to the same person over the last 10 days? And Amy says at that point, something kind of clicked for her. It was like, yes, it is actually, now that you mention it, through my fog of sleep deprivation and my desperate efforts to help this failing woman, like, yeah, it is a bit odd that all of these things have happened to the same person. And that's when Amy remembers something, which is at some point when Caitlyn is in this hospital bed getting, which string of bad news, I can't remember. Amy heard a dog bark, which is not something one normally hears when they're dying in a hospital room.
No.
So once that clicked in her brain, she and Katie went down this rabbit hole where they just basically were like looking into all the communications that Caitlyn had sent them. They were reverse image searching the pictures of the tumors that had come, or the big blood clots that had come out of her body, and finding them on Wikipedia. And then finally, I think it was Katie who called the hospital and said, do you have a patient there by the name of Kaitlyn Braun? And they said, no. So at that point, they knew, but they also didn't know, right? Because you then know that this is not true. What she's been telling you is not true. But there's still the much bigger mystery of why would someone do this to you? And why would someone do this to you for 10 days? It didn't make any sense. So then they had a whole new odyssey basically to go on.
Did they confront her? Did they talk to her about it? Or did they just kind of disappear?
I think they just sort of disappeared. And I think, I think there are a couple doulas who confronted Caitlyn, but what's interesting is they were either doulas who were not directly involved with her, or I'd say had like less traumatic experiences. And I think the instinct of most of the doulas who felt very wounded by, Caitlyn's deep manipulation, by basically having their sense of reality destroyed by her, their first instinct was just to get as far away from her as possible.
In Amy and Katie's story, the part that baffled me, a lot of it baffled me, but she was able to fake a lot of kind of sounds. Like she got on a helicopter at one point. She was in cars. She was beeping in hospitals. How did she pull all of that off? Do we know?
No, we don't know. I mean, people report her getting into an Uber and like hearing her getting into an Uber and talking to the driver, and they can hear the car is going, so I wonder if it was a combination of like sound effects off her computer and a combination of actually doing some of these things. Like, I mean, she really got off on pretending to be pregnant. So maybe she also really got off on pretending to getting into an Uber and going to a hospital to give birth. Maybe she was walking around a hospital and that's why they heard some of these background noises, like people being paged or things like, buzzing or dinging. So we don't know. We don't really have an answer for that. And so far as I know, there's no pregnancy faker sound effects suite you can buy off of
download
in the App Store. But many people I spoke to have told me that they did hear these things going on in the background. So she was, I think it just sort of speaks to how deeply committed she was to fooling people.
Just how many victims are we talking about? How many doulas have been Caitlyn's victim?
We don't know. And I suspect, as with many of these sort of crimes that involve intimacy, it's probably more than we know of. What we do know is that at one point there was a group chat of doulas who had all had experiences being lied to by Caitlyn. And the last time I checked in, there were over 50 doulas in that group.
And we've just heard one of those stories, like one of
Yes.
like 50 times.
Yeah. I mean, they varied. They weren't all, what's also interesting about Caitlyn is it wasn't all done virtually or on the phone. Like some of these doulas met her. And, sometimes when they met her, she was giving birth to a live baby. She was still pregnant as a result of a sexual assault. She was still struggling with family relationships, but she was giving birth to a live baby, what she told them. And so, I've seen pictures of Caitlyn in labor, taken by doulas. And she really appears to be exhausted and sweaty and going through the motions of labor.
Well, let's paint that picture a little bit through Kate, because Kate was a doula that saw her in person at a house, or her house, might not have been her house, who knows.
Yeah.
But she did see some red flags kind of from the beginning, didn't she? Even being in person with her.
There was something, Kate's really interesting because I'm not sure that there was anything in particular that Caitlyn did or said, but Kate had a gut feeling that something was off about this situation. And, she's going over to Caitlyn's house, or, and I'm unclear whether it's her house or it was an Airbnb she rented, but she's going over to a house where Caitlyn says she's going to give birth. And one of the thoughts that flashes into Kate's mind is, I'm going to be kidnapped. And it may have been the fact that Caitlyn texted to her some variation of, I hope you don't mind if I'm naked or topless when you get here. And there was something about that seemed to imply a lack of boundaries, bad judgment. I don't know exactly how she unpacked it in her process, but there was something about that where Kate just thought, there's something off here, and this is a bit dangerous, but she couldn't articulate it. And then, of course, when she gets there, and Caitlyn is a woman in her early 20s who desperately needs assistance and is lonely and is in discomfort and has a really sad story, then doula Kate, takes over and she tries to take care of Caitlyn the best of her ability.
Can you tell us about the more sexual side of Kate's experience? Because that uncomfortableness you mentioned evolved into some other kind of areas.
It did, yeah. And a number of the doulas mentioned that they feel that there was some form of sexual gratification wrapped up in Caitlyn's emotional motivations. Caitlyn really wanted to talk in graphic detail about her experience of being sexually assaulted. Doulas reported, she really wanted them and encouraged them, very physical aspects of their work, for example, like massage. And then Caitlyn wanted to be naked while she was being massaged. And it made a lot of doulas really uncomfortable, but they also didn't want to make Caitlyn uncomfortable because she was in labor and they're trying to make her as comfortable as possible.
And it's not unusual for laboring women to want to be naked as well.
Yeah, that's
right.
So
they wouldn't have questioned certain parts of it.
That's right. Yeah. So all of that's one of the things that's really interesting too about Caitlyn, right? She stayed very close to the lines where it was very easy to rationalize anything she was telling you, even if you sort of felt like something wasn't right. But other doulas, including Kate, also note that they felt that Caitlyn was masturbating at those points when they were engaged with her. And most of the doulas that I spoke to got that impression that she was masturbating over the phone, especially when they were talking about more physical aspects of giving birth, things like nipple stimulation and things like that.
Yeah.
Kate was giving Caitlyn a massage. Caitlyn was undressed. Caitlyn was lying on the bed or sort of hunched over the bed. Kate was standing on the side. She was massaging Caitlyn's shoulders. And then Kate believes that she saw Caitlyn's hand touching her vulva and that she was masturbating while this was happening. Obviously, all without Kate's consent.
Yeah.
And so, then very, very quickly after that, Kate discovers that Caitlyn is not who she said she was. And this sort of alarming incident becomes like much more perilous.
How did she discover that? Was it a Google search? Was she so uncomfortable that she kind of excused herself and did a bit of research?
When she believes that Caitlyn is masturbating and she's freaked out and she sort of walks into the other room, like excuses herself. And it's like her mind is sort of spinning because she's like, who is this person and what is she doing? And like, what is this situation? She's trying to process. And then she kind of like a jolt remembers something, which is that on Facebook, she had read that there was a woman who was faking pregnancy. And when she kind of remembered that, it was like several pieces fell into place because she was like, there were so many things off at this situation, and it seemed like they were conclusive enough for her to walk away and leave this, this woman with this terrible story on her own. But when she remembers that, she goes on Facebook and she does a search in doula group, and she finds the post. And the post says that this woman's name is Kaitlyn Braun. And so at that moment, Kate knows that's who's in the other room. That is who she's dealing with. And she basically gets out of the apartment as quickly as she can, gets into her car and speeds away.
The post that Kate found was made by another doula who was conned, called Shauna. She was kind of not the first, but one of the first to really kind of get the message out there, or try and get the message out there and spread the word that there was this person out there doing that. Can you tell us about the community she ended up creating of all of these women?
Sure. Yeah, so there were two doulas that really got the word out that, I think a lot of them posted, but I would say two of them had posts that really, really took off. And one was another Amy Silva, who's one of the first doulas who posted on TikTok. And the other one was Shauna. And I actually really love Shauna's story because, Shauna was at the point, as many of these doulas were, where she didn't feel like police were listening. They told the doulas that there wasn't really anything that they could do, and their only recourse was to warn people about Caitlyn. So they decided that's what they were going to do to the best of their ability. So they take to social media. Shauna makes this post about this really horrifying experience she's had with Caitlyn, and her feelings about being misled. And it's a very, very emotional post, but that's not why it initially got traction. It initially got traction because she meant to add the hashtag doulas of TikTok and accidentally added the hashtag dogs of TikTok, which I guess is like a very devoted community of people who like immediately saw this post and started boosting it. Oh. So I guess there's like a lot of crossover in the dog doula communities of people who are interested in stories like this. Yeah. So her post absolutely exploded. And, I think within a day or two of the doulas really starting to post on TikTok, they had, thousands and thousands of views, and Caitlyn was ultimately arrested.
A lot of these doulas did try and go to the police. Why couldn't they do anything? Had they exchanged money in these services? Does that even do anything in this instance? Why initially did the police say we can't help?
I think that our system is accustomed to primarily adjudicating financial crimes and violent crimes. And Caitlyn doesn't really fall under those two categories. What she does is almost more akin to kind of like personal betrayal.
Well, it's manipulation. It's emotional.
Yeah, it's very emotional, but we don't prosecute emotional crimes in our courts. That's otherwise everyone would take their ex-boyfriend to court. It's just not typically how the system is set up. However, having said that, I think that this was also a really fundamentally icky case. Like, I think a lot of people listen to the details and cringe. A lot of these cops that they were talking to, like, my guess is they thought this all sounded pretty gross and didn't want to get involved. They thought that this was kind of like bullshit between women. And, that also, I think they really underestimated the harm. I think they thought, okay, so this woman lied to you about being pregnant. What's the big deal? Obviously, they had the capacity to charge Caitlyn because they ended up charging her, and she was charged with multiple counts of harassment, fraud, and ultimately indecent acts. She was originally charged with sexual assault, which was downgraded. And it's not because she took money. If I've seen all of the court documents, this case was not adjudicated because Caitlyn stole people's time, and time is money in business. That's not what she was doing in court. It was because of the manipulation. It was because of the fraud. It was because she kept emailing these women with, under false pretenses. There are tools at the disposal of the justice system, but I think police can be reluctant to use them in these cases. And I think there are questions, of course, about Caitlyn's mental health. And she, frankly, seems quite pathetic. Like, she really does. Like, this all seems so desperate, and it's sad. I mean, she was arrested, and she was 24 years old when she was arrested, and a registered social worker, and obviously has major mental health challenges, responsible for her actions, but has major mental health challenges. And so I think there was some hope that maybe this could be dealt with outside of the criminal justice system. But the problem is Caitlyn just wouldn't stop. So what do you do with her?
And I also want to reiterate how this affected people, because we've kind of touched on a few of the stories, but there was one doula in there that Caitlyn apparently died, and she went and got a tattoo. And can you tell us about the emotional toll, just how much this affected these women?
Yeah, it had a huge impact on these women. And I think it had both personal and professional repercussions. Like, I think on a personal level, it's really hard to overstate how devastating it is to have your sense of reality destroyed. Like, to have attempted to help someone, to have given them everything, your time, your energy, all of your compassion over a period of days or longer, and then find out that not only does this situation not really exist, but this person that they have forced you to care about doesn't really exist. I think there's something there that really shakes what I think people don't understand is a fairly fragile social trust. The idea that we can believe people when they tell us, and particularly when they tell us they need help. It's really devastating. I think that a lot of the doulas have struggled with Caitlyn's treatment of them as some sort of means to an emotional end, that there was sort of were functionally dehumanized by her, treated like tools for her own gratification. That's really, really hard for a lot of these doulas who really pride themselves in their work and their selflessness and their commitment to women who need them. And I think it's been hard for them to get back on track with that.
Did it force some of them to leave the profession?
I don't know if anyone has left permanently who wasn't already considering leaving.
Right.
Like Katie, who was involved with Amy in that first story we discussed, she already had kind of one foot out the door. She works as a photographer, I think Caitlyn was probably a final push. I know a lot of doulas have changed the way they practice. Doulas have reported to me like a sense of panic with patients or with clients who have reported similar narratives to Caitlyn's, where they just kind of shut down and panic.
Which is heartbreaking because people who have actually been through that need someone who trusts them 100%.
That's right. Yeah. And now that trust is shattered, and it's created this kind of suspicion and self-doubt that's not for anyone.
After the break, we find out what the courts made of this case and if any justice has been brought to the victims. So let's get to the court proceedings. She's arrested early 2023 on multiple charges, as you mentioned. By early 2024, and she's been in prison all this time, so about 10-ish months, she's facing sentencing. She's pled guilty.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked a little bit about mental health, but was it properly examined during that process? What was said about potentially factitious disorder, which you mentioned at the top? What are we dealing with here?
Well, I mean, what are we dealing with here? I mean, that's hard to say. You know, Caitlyn has a litany of diagnoses. And, you know, when the Crown attorney, the prosecutor, was reading some of the facts into the record, I think he said that Caitlyn had like 160, 180 court visits over a very short period of time. You know, she just kept going back to the hospital. And for things like, you know, I mean, for attempting suicide, but also things like swallowing batteries and, you know, just a whole litany of things she was looking for attention for and that she was struggling with. So it's really, really hard to nail down exactly what you're looking at in terms of somebody's physical and psychological health when their whole thing is lying about that. You know, I mean, she had a court-ordered assessment, which rejected a diagnosis of factitious disorder, which didn't make a ton of sense to me and doesn't make a ton of sense to experts that I've spoken to, but they haven't examined her, nor have I. And factitious disorder is, you know, when women fabricate illnesses and crises for attention, which seems to very much fit what Caitlyn does. They said she had borderline personality disorder. She's also been diagnosed with depressive disorders, anxiety disorders. I mean, it's actually... The thing about Caitlyn's discussion, the discussion of Caitlyn's health in court is it's incredibly sad, but it's incredibly sad in two ways. One, you look at this unbelievable volume of paperwork, all of the diagnoses for this, you know, at the time she was, I think, when we were discussing this in court, I believe she was 26. And that is incredibly sad. But it's additionally sad that so much of this is likely fabricated. She's a completely unreliable source. She gets off on being ill. So how on earth do you actually adjudicate any of this? Where do you land in terms of an assessment of how healthy she is or what her diagnoses are or what she needs?
What was she like? What was Caitlyn like in the courtroom?
She appeared to be very remorseful. I just remember she was wearing this very thick burgundy sweater, roll neck sweater, made almost no eye contact with the gallery or with anyone really. In particular, when the doulas were reading their victim impact statements, a number of them cried, a number of them were angry. She just looked down at the ground and she just gradually, because it took almost 2 hours for all of the doulas to read their victim impact statements into the record. And as she looked at the ground, her head just slumped deeper and deeper and deeper until I could just barely make out like the ponytail on the top of her head. And she read a statement where she said that, you know, she had learned and she was very remorseful and she didn't want to do this again. And she understands that she hurt people. And, you know, she said for sure the things that one might say in that situation if one was remorseful.
What was the sentence? What did she end up getting?
The prosecutor, defense attorney, agreed on a joint submission. So they basically had come to a consensus position before presenting it to the judge. It's very unorthodox in those circumstances here, according to judicial precedent, for a judge to reject that. You know, if the Crown and defense have agreed, unless there's some reason in law that he can't accept it, he functionally rubber stamps it.
Yeah.
In this case, the judge, so we actually, you know, I remember going in there with my producer and we knew that there was a joint submission and, you know, we went in for, you know, I think court started around 9:30 or 10 and we were like, this is great. We'll be out in like, even with the other cases they had that morning, they would probably try to get through before Caitlyn's. We were like, we're going to be out in an hour or two. We'll go to the Thai place down the street. Like, no problem. We were still in court like 6 hours later because the judge looked at what was being presented, which was the suggestion that she would receive a conditional sentence, which is like house arrest, basically.
Yeah. So
she would be back at home with her mother. And the judge said, this woman is at an incredibly high risk to reoffend. Like, I have all the reports here that say she's going to do this again. You know, we're proposing therapy for her, or at least the Crown and defense were proposing therapy for her, but it's like really specific, specialized, expensive therapy. Like, can she get this in her small town? Like, who offers this therapy? Is she on the wait list? You know? So it became like a whole question of, it was sort of an interesting debate that had not transpired to that point about what the the real threat of releasing Caitlyn, how likely she was to reoffend, whether, there needed to be a more serious consideration of the public safety issues in this case. And then also, what do you do with her? Like, what kind of therapy does she need? Will she benefit from that therapy? Like, can she get that therapy? We have a public system here. She doesn't come from a super affluent family. Will she be on a wait list for a year? And what happens until then? And will the therapy even work? And these are sort of questions that hadn't really been considered. And so we sat there as this like fascinating debate ensued about what exactly to do with this woman. And the sentencing hearing was adjourned that day with no resolution. And we ended up back a month later to hear the decision.
The judge ultimately agreed with the sentence because
he had no other choice.
The hands were kind of tied. There was no other choice. But everything he says is so valid.
Yeah, that's right.
Because she did reoffend, didn't she? She was let out on house arrest.
She was.
And she did it again.
She was let out on house arrest on February 14th. And by the end of April, she was back in jail. Yeah.
And how many victims did she have in that time, do we know?
That we know of, 2.
So as of now, we're recording this April 2025. Is she still in prison?
She is. So she has now been sentenced on those new charges. So, and this time, it's customary in Canada that typically I believe you're eligible for parole after serving a third of your sentence. So you're eligible for early release. I don't think that will happen in this case because she's already proven that she'll breach the terms of her release as she did with her conditional sentence when she reoffended when she was on house arrest. So Caitlyn will be sitting in jail, in prison for almost 3 years. She'll be released at the end of 2027 or early 2028.
But we've got no kind of guarantee that that's going to actually do anything. She could just sit in prison for 3 years and get out and do this again, or potentially, go to a different con that doesn't involve doulas.
Yeah.
Like, how do you rehabilitate someone like this?
That's one of the core questions here. Like, how do you rehabilitate someone? How do you make someone well who desperately wants to be sick? It's an incredibly challenging thing. And, I have no doubt she's not getting particularly sophisticated mental health care in prison. But, she's also presents a quandary to treatment. So, I think I'll be very curious to see what Caitlyn does when she's released. And I would actually be very curious to know what she's up to in prison because she's got to be doing something to meet those emotional needs. And I would love to know what it is.
How common is something like this? Because it feels like such a unusual crime to be talking about. Is it more common than we think? We do have something called factitious disorder, which means there are multiple people that fall into that category. Is it more common?
It's in the DSM. It's a thing, Dr. Mark Feldman, who we interviewed on the podcast and who I've spoken to for multiple stories and have been in contact with for about a decade. He's one of the world's foremost experts on factitious disorders. And he likes to say that it's not common, but it's less rare than we think. And I think that's really a good way to look at it. And what's interesting is, I hear all the time about people who are either suspected or who have been busted for faking a little cancer. It's not nearly the scale of what Caitlyn did. Caitlyn is absolutely an outlier. Her behavior is very unusual. And the fact that she was that prolific at such an early age, very, very unusual. Have never heard another case quite like that. But, I think a lot of us, we don't do this, but what we do understand is the power of illness and desperation and crisis in forcing reactions in other people. It's a way where it buys us out of responsibility. It buys us goodwill. And, in times when you genuinely need that, that's very important. But when you fake it and weaponize it, then it's a really harmful manipulation.
What are you hoping that people get from hearing this story in detail, particularly in helping people understand how, I'm going to use quotations, but non-violent crimes like this emotional kind of manipulation have an effect on victims?
Yeah, I mean, I hope when people listen to this, they hear the complications in the story. Like, I think on its face, of course, it's like a super salacious, outrageous story. It is also full of questions about the nature of harm and how we adjudicate things in the criminal justice system and what it means to be responsible for your actions in the context of mental illness. I think it's very interesting, these relationships where somebody like Caitlyn manipulates somebody, but also makes them feel amazing about how they're able to provide these things to someone in need. And I think that's a really complicated relationship. And I think it's something, one of our interviewees described it as betrayal trauma, where, you think you're helping someone and then you find out it was actually in service to a lie. That's a really complicated relationship. And I think a much more intimate form of harm.
Do you think that our courts, I'm saying our, we're in different countries, but all courts need to do more? I mean, here in Australia, for instance, we've recently had coercive control being brought into our legislation and things like that are those more emotional kind of manipulations. Do we need to be thinking more in this space in our justice systems?
I mean, I don't really know whether more of these cases should be adjudicated in the criminal justice system, but then I don't know what our alternative is for someone like Caitlyn who won't stop. I think there are absolutely people who require resources and patience and assistance to overcome really, really terrible behavior. And what do we do with somebody who's not genuinely sorry and will not commit to ceasing harm? I don't know how we deal with that outside of the criminal justice system.
Thanks to Sarah for helping us to tell this story. True Crime Conversations is a podcast hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, and Tali Blackman, with audio design by Jacob Round. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.